We'll get to the season as a whole for Penn State in just a second. But what an end for Sean Clifford. Here's a guy who many times this year was criticized to the point where this fan base wanted Drew Aller, the highly talented freshman, to come in and replace him. And James Franklin, to his credit, said, this is Sean Clifford's team. To me, it is a very fitting way for Sean Clifford to finish his career.
And most of us saw that photo that he posted on social media of himself standing outside the Rose Bowl as a young child, dreaming of what we got to see play out yesterday. Him as the quarterback for a squad on the field at the Rose Bowl, leading his team to a victory. And he got to experience that in the final game of his Penn State career. Just such a gratifying moment, such an emotional moment for him, for his head coach, for so many teammates. It reminded me a little bit, I think back to, it's been about a decade at this point, the end of Darrell Clark's career, and, not quite as majestic in the Capital One Bowl, the Citrus Bowl at the time against LSU, but a capper to the career of a guy who was a multi-year starter, who maybe the fan base wasn't always completely on board with, but had so much success in his career. And this truly cements Sean Clifford, especially when you look at some of the statistics that are associated with it. He is one of the all-time greats in Nittany Lion lore.
And how about the record setters? His pass to Keandre Lambert, the longest in Rose Bowl history as far as a touchdown pass is concerned. The run by Nicholas Singleton, that's the third longest run in Rose Bowl history as far as touchdown runs are concerned. This was a team that was built defensively. We'll touch on defense in a second, but I was really impressed by how efficient Penn State was on offense.
It started with the guys up front. That offensive line, because facing a Utah opponent where Kyle Whittingham has built that squad on the line of scrimmage for years. They call them Sack Lake City for a reason. They lead the Pac-12 in sacks every year, lead the Pac-12 in run defense every season. Just a feisty and ferocious front seven for Utah. And we've seen the last couple of seasons, the way that Penn State's offensive line has struggled. They grew this year, suffered through some injuries, but got to the Rose Bowl as healthy as they could muster. And that challenge of Utah's defensive front was going to be as mammoth as any challenge they faced this season against any front seven on defense. And they answered the call. It wasn't like they were just blowing Utah off the ball, but they made creases. And those young, talented running backs were getting the job done. You talked about the combustible talents of Nicholas Singleton getting out in the open space. But beyond that, they protected the quarterback. That's a part of where Kirk Ciarrocca's system, having run-pass balance and the success that it led to running the football, it also enhanced the way that they could protect the quarterback because they had struggled in pass pro for a couple of seasons here. This season, they protected Sean Clifford, and in this game yesterday at the Rose Bowl, protected him at a very high level, and that comfort really showed in the way he threw the football.
Now, Utah was unable to protect Cam Rising and his backup after Rising got hurt in the second half, and I give Manny Diaz a ton of credit. He did a great job all year long, but he may have earned that big-time DC money with the adjustments he made at the half because James Franklin admitted it. He said the difference in the football game was how much pressure Penn State's defense got on Utah after the break.
And we've seen the individual pass rushers like Abdul Carter, Denai Dennis Sutton, you name it. Penn State has had guys who can get after the quarterback up front. But Manny Diaz wants to pillage the village. He is going to find a way to heat up the opposing backfield. And so even when it's not just that defensive front, if you don't have P.J. Mustipher getting into the backfield, you know what? We'll trade gap responsibilities. P.J. slant over here. Here's a linebacker or a DB in the A gap or the B gap or off the edge. Jair Brown sacking the quarterback. So he brings it every which way. And so especially once a backup quarterback enters the game who's uncertain about things anyway. We saw it play out a little bit in last year's Rose Bowl, but this year's Penn State defense, certainly beyond what we saw from Ohio State's defense last year. And once that blood was in the water, Rick, they really were on a seek and destroy mission.
9 tackles for loss, 6 sacks among those 9, 2 takeaways. You mentioned Jair Brown. He came up with a big pick. At the end of the day, it is 35-21 Penn State. And chew on this for a minute. An 11-win season, that's the second 11-win season of Sean Clifford's career. And remember, the only 2 losses this year for Penn State to Ohio State and Michigan, 2 teams that were a part of this year's college football playoff. Of course, those teams are no longer a part of this year's college football playoff. We begin chronologically with the Fiesta Bowl and Michigan's loss to TCU. I think this was the more surprising of the 2 losses as far as most people are concerned. And when you look back at this game, Michigan a big-time favorite because many people on the outside thought that they were just so much more physical so much more strong, that they would be able to overtake TCU at the line of scrimmage. That wasn't the case.
And I think part of what played out as I evaluated the game itself was that TCU's defensive front, their front seven especially, they move a lot. They use their quickness to their advantage. And so for Michigan's offensive line, it essentially played out. When they could get their hands on them, they were effective running the football. The problem was you saw a TCU front seven that was on the move so consistently, and sometimes it would be a third-level defender who would come in and penetrate into the backfield. And that's where the landmarks for an offensive line can really be thrown off, because you see pre-snap the alignment showing you one thing. So that means your coordination, your footwork, everyone moving in unison will take you in one direction. But then when they trade gap responsibilities, when they slant, when they stunt, when folks are run blitzing at you, now all of a sudden you have additional blocking surfaces to hit. And TCU was just so effective operating downhill towards that Michigan backfield. It got to the point in game where Michigan was almost forced, their hand was forced to say, let's attack vertically, and they became effective in that regard. But it did lead to the first time we've seen this Michigan offense turn the football over.
Michigan also put itself in a really tough spot. They fumble on the goal line after a very controversial overrule on the touchdown catch, which I still believe to this day was in fact the touchdown. This after Michigan failed to score a touchdown when they were inside the 10-yard line earlier in the first quarter, trying to do some trickeration that didn't really work out. J.J. McCarthy throws a couple of pick sixes, and yet they still have a chance to win this game. I think in the second half, when Michigan realized that McCarthy's legs had to be part of the game plan, they became so much more effective. I just wonder why you didn't go to that a little bit earlier.
I was calling for it. I was tweeting about it early in the game. You have a quarterback that athletic. And frankly, J.J. McCarthy, when he was throwing it to his own team, threw the ball pretty effectively. It was a career high in passing yards, but there was a lot of pocket-based passing game. And where TCU was able to bring force into the backfield because of some of their movement, then why not use J.J. McCarthy as a runner? He's capable of that, even though he hasn't been a volume carrier throughout the season in any individual game. When he's had the ball as a runner, especially in a called scenario, he's been really effective. We know he's athletic, he's fast. It gives the defense another responsibility to concern themselves with, and especially when you factor in, you got to think about Donovan Edwards, where the cast is on the right hand, but that doesn't only negate some of his effectiveness as an explosive pass receiver, but then also he always has to carry the football in his left hand. There were multiple times in the first half where he would get out into the open field and run towards the sideline, but then when the football's in his inside arm, a defender comes to collision him. They got lucky when the ball squirted out of bounds a couple of times. I do think that ended up enhancing some of the discomfort that Michigan had with handing Edwards the football in the red zone, because when you've basically got only one hand to truly cover up with, ball security can become a big concern. That just added to my urge to see J.J. McCarthy carry the football, especially in some of those early red zone moments.
Michigan back to the college football playoff for a second straight season. Before the second straight season, they lose in the semifinals. And once again, as we go into the offseason, you will hear them. The rumors about Jim Harbaugh. Will he be back in Ann Arbor? Will he be off to the NFL? Obviously, we will keep everyone updated. We will keep our ears to the ground to be listening in. But trust me, you will hear a lot of conjecture about this before we actually get some factual information about where Jim Harbaugh will be in 2023.
I did think it was funny that Jim Harbaugh, he started throwing some of the other Big Ten coaches' names in there as well. Like, why aren't you mentioning P.J. Fleck and Greg Schiano and Ryan Day?
Ryan Day
good coaches
is an interesting name because as much as Ohio State has accomplished over the past 2 years, Ryan Day's made it clear. He says at the beginning of every year we have 3 goals. Beat Michigan, win the Big Ten, win the national title. In that regard, they are 0 for 6 over the last 2 seasons. So how do you assess, before we get into specifically this game, how do you assess what 2022 was for Ohio State?
It was an excellent season that did not meet their standards, because their standard is beyond the norm. Their standard is amongst the 1% of the 1%. Their standard has been for an extended period of time here, national championship or bust. And when you don't achieve that, and then you don't achieve some of those other more tertiary kind of goals, then for Ohio State, the season ended with disappointment. And there are very few programs that are truly a part of that conversation in college football, but the Buckeyes are one of those programs. Michigan now entering that conversation with the last 2 years they've had here. But for Ohio State, how do you continue to tweak or adjust. I don't think the major overhaul that it felt like was necessary from last year, it doesn't feel like that's necessary going into this offseason. But Ryan Day has already begun addressing some of the ways that he may tweak or adjust things, maybe giving up the offensive play call duties to be more of a CEO-style head coach. We heard some of that reporting out there. But I don't think this is an offseason that matches last year's disappointment.
I agree, and I would be surprised if Day were willing to do that after the game that he called against Georgia, because I understand, and I think it was fair, some of the criticism he took for decisions and play calling decisions that he made against Michigan. I thought he called one of the best games of his career against Georgia. C.J. Stroud executed it as well as he had throughout his career. Probably this game in the Rose Bowl, you could argue maybe the best back-to-back postseason performances by any quarterback in the history of college football, and still unable to get it done against a Georgia team, Anthony, that, listen, at the end of the day, this team has been there. They've done it. They know what it takes in the final seconds of one of the biggest stages in this sport.
And they were effectively at home as well.
Basically,
and so
yes.
that's one of those additional factors that end up, playing into the result, the final result of the game. Now, they've earned that potential home game because it was the site of one of the college football playoff matchups. They're the number one seed. So they earned that right as the number one team in the country, the number one team in the college football playoff. But that is a factor that Ohio State had to wrestle with. And so, we talked throughout the season about the limited time they had with Jackson Smith and Jigma. And then later in the season, you lose Travion Henderson. Those are two Heisman caliber players who weren't a part of Ohio State's offense. So going into the bowl game that they're not there. But then also, you lose one of the best tight ends in the Big Ten, Cade Stover. You get into the fourth quarter of the game where your offense had been rolling, and now the new best receiver in America, Marvin Harrison Jr., isn't able to finish the game for you. You only scored 3 points after Marvin Harrison Jr. isn't out there. And so there was sort of this cascade of weapons. Mine Williams played in the game, but he wasn't Mine
100%.
Williams. Yeah, you used him in a couple of short yardage scenarios early. But C.J. Stroud, it's so unfortunate that a performance like that was had in a loss, because that was the game of his life. I mean, he threw the ball so beautifully in last year's Rose Bowl. There's no doubt about that. But when you factor in all those other extraneous circumstances, this to me was an even better game for C.J. Stroud than the Rose Bowl from last year, because a national championship berth was on the line, because it was against the number one team in the country, because it was on the road in a hostile environment with weapons just falling all around him. And he just had such a mastery of the moment, such generalship of the field, and he would not allow his teammates to feel downtrodden, to feel like they were going to be left behind in this game, and led them down the field with an opportunity to get to the cusp of a victory. So yes, there's a couple of late play calls you want to question or tweak a little bit, but I believe it was the best combination of C.J. Stroud and Ryan Day, where my criticism of Ryan Day over the years has been, keep moving the pocket. Keep some run-pass balance. Don't put everything on your QB as a pocket passer. And I thought he really effectively stayed within a more effective game plan against that Georgia defensive front that allowed them to keep that pass rush off balance. And when that pass rush did get home, we saw the most mobile, most aggressive running version of C.J. Stroud we've ever seen. The full arsenal was on display for the Buckeye QB.
Yeah, Urban Meyer said it during our pregame coverage. He said C.J. Stroud had to do anything and everything in his power to extend and make plays, whether it was with his legs or his arm, and he did exactly that. Of course, we expect C.J. Stroud to be part of the 2023 NFL Draft. Now, if he shocked the world and came back to Columbus, Ohio State, potentially preseason number one next season, though right now we say that pretty much every season. We are back on Big Ten today as the Rutgers men's basketball Twitter account simply states, knocking off number one is in our DNA. Steve Peichel and the Scarlet Knights beating Purdue for a second straight year in dramatic fashion. This one perhaps more impressive than the victory that was defined by Ron Harper's game winner, because this one took place inside Mackey instead of inside Jersey Mike's. And with that in mind, welcome in Purdue alum Rayfel Davis to the show. I know it's a hard one to swallow for anybody who wore the black and gold, but I think it's also fair to say it's not as huge a surprise as some on the outside are making it out to be.
Yeah, it wasn't a huge surprise. But if you know this Rutgers team, you know this is how they play. They play stifling defense, and it's something that with Purdue, you try to prepare for them. You try to prepare for the physicality of Rutgers. You try to prepare for their size and their length. But back when I played, it was like preparing for a Michigan State team. You know they're going to beat you up. You know they're going to be physical. And you can't simulate that in practice. You can't simulate a 6'7" point guard in Paul Mulcahy to Braden Smith. It's something he's never seen before. Fletcher Lawyer's never seen a defensive player in the defensive player of the year in the Big Ten. He got every taste of that one. I just think Rutgers, they were more physical, mentally, and just with their bodies throwing Purdue around.
Before we get to what went wrong with Purdue, I want to talk about what went right for Rutgers. You talked about the physicality. You talked about the defense. A big-time shot from Cam Spencer, a guy who is remarkably confident for maybe not being such a great pure scorer, but he gets his shot off and he scores when it really counts. You mentioned Paul Mulcahy. At one point, I think he scored 10 straight. He's the heart and soul of this team. What is it in general about this Rutgers squad, whether it's inside Jersey Mike's or now on the road, first win ever away from home against the number one, that makes it just so nasty?
They're old, they're long, they know their roles, they know their identities, they play within themselves, they play together, and then they have leadership. Paul Mulcahy is a great leader in that locker room. Cliff Amore is a great leader. Caleb McConnell's a great leader. And normally when you have your best players on the floor, they've got to be leaders. They've got to be your hardest workers. And Rutgers has that. So when you get transfers in, like a Cam Spencer, or you get a freshman in Derek Simpson, they got to fit within that mold. If the upperclassmen are doing it, everybody else has to do it. And then Paul Mulcahy was special those last 5 minutes. He had 9 of the final 13 points. He even assisted on that three-point shot to Cam Spencer, accumulating for 12 of their last 13. His stat line goes 16, 8, and 6, 0
Pretty
turnovers in 37 minutes on the road. He was big time, and then Cam Spencer making shots. It's just this Rutgers team defensively and their identity, they gonna get you.
I love what Matt Painter said after this game. He said, listen, if I'm taking my team and we're going to war, we're stopping in New Jersey on the way, and we're picking up Rutgers because they're coming along with us. Briefly, if Purdue could have done anything different, what would it have been in this game?
They got to make shots. The last 5 games, they're just shooting the ball 23% from 3. And it's a team that to start the season, they were the best three-point shoot team in the league. So it's like overnight, they went from the best to the very bottom of the Big Ten. So they've got to make the open ones. They got good looks. The open ones have got to go in, especially when you think about the shooters they have on that roster. They missed 9 free throws. Got to make those at home. And then 13 turnovers led to 18 points for Rutgers. 9 of those were steals. Paul Mulcahy had 4 steals. You got to take care of the basketball and not give it to the other team.
You want to talk about a team right now that can shoot and a team that can score and a team that is buying in to their fairly new coach's mentality? Yeah. That's Penn State.
Yep.
Nittany Lions knock off Iowa. We'll get to the Hawkeyes in a second. I know it's a struggle right now for Fran McCaffrey's team. But you know how much I love Jalen Pickett. Yeah. I think he can get his whenever he wants. That's basically been proven. Micah Shrewsbury is clearly getting into these guys. Yeah. And I think they're more talented as a whole than people are giving them credit for.
I mean, they got 2 guys on their roster that scored over 1,800 points. You think about Jalen Pickett and Ken Winter. Those guys have been around college basketball. They know how to put the ball in the hole. You're not going to surprise them too much with many defenses. They've seen it all, and they know what's going on. Seth Lundy's one of the better defenders in the league. Miles Dredd, it feels like he's been around college basketball forever. He makes shots from all over the court. Andrew Funk is a flamethrower. When he's open, you might as well count it. So they got guys that can score the ball, put it in the basket, but I credit it to last season. Coach Shrewsbury built an identity with these guys.
A guy who you know well.
And when Coach Shrewsbury, he's on something, he sticks into it well. He wants you to be tough. He wants you to be nasty. He wants you to defend at a high level, and he wants you to play hard. The offensive stuff, he can get you shots. He can get the open guy shot. He can get the ball where it needs to be. But their identity was built last season, and they're just following through with that this year.
What about the other side of this coin? Iowa suddenly 0-3 inside the Big Ten. You add to that one of the biggest upsets in college basketball history when they lost at home to Eastern Illinois. What's gone wrong with the Hawkeyes?
I think they got to get better point guard play. You got to have somebody be able to set the table. And missing Jordan Bohannon, it's a great deal to this team. You think about when they went on that run last year to end the year out, win the Big Ten tournament championship. They put J-Bo at the point guard position. He was setting the table for other guys. They don't have that this year. Ulis, Bowen, they haven't turned out to be those guys that they need them to be. Tony Perkins is such an aggressive player that sometimes to set the table, he got to relax a little bit. But he wants to go, go, go. And then a guy like Peyton Sanford, you talk to those guys in the offseason. I spoke with Patrick McCaffrey a lot. He let me know Peyton Sanford will be one of the guys in the Big Ten this season. And he's yet to make a basket in Big Ten play. So they're going to need those role players to go along with Chris Murray. When he gets 30 and 12, someone else has to get 12, 14 points to go along with it.
When you play at that pace and you're frenetic and you're forcing it sometimes, it's great when things are going really well. When things start to go south, sometimes it's hard to slow down and get yourself back to where you need to be to try to figure everything out. Well, Michigan certainly figured things out against Maryland. I mean, this game was over about 8 to 10 minutes in. Did this result in Michigan's complete blowout of the Terps tell you more about Michigan or tell you more about Maryland?
Michigan. And it showed me a lot about their team. They needed this type of performance just to come out and just dog a team, and that's exactly what they did. I think Hunter Dickinson, he needed this type of performance. He needed a 30 and 12 game, and he needed to do it in this fashion. He needed to take 16 to 20 shots, feel like the man on the floor, let his teammates know when we need a bucket, throw it to me. And they also needed to have a game where they don't shoot the ball well from three, and they still win the game. They were 3 for 11 from three in this game, which is surprising when you look at how many points they scored and how bad they beat Maryland. But they still were able to double them up in the paint. Kobe Buffkin didn't play well. Jet Howard didn't play well. But when they go to that big fella down low, he's the guy.
To me, the next couple of games, Rafael, will be very telling for Maryland. They got off to such a great start, one of the best starts ever under a first-year head coach in Kevin Willard. And now there's been a lot of ups and downs. And I think with all the transfers and the young guys that they have in there, I think even as we get into January, they may still be trying to figure out what the right mix of chemistry is.
Yeah, and they're definitely figuring it out right now. You think about having transfers come in, a new coach come in, and you get off to great success. You get ranked. First time they've been ranked in a while. This is the first time they have to figure out who they are as a team. The players figure out who their coach is when he loses. The coach figures out who Dante Scott is when we lose some games. How can I get to him? So right now is a pivotal point for this Maryland team to be able to bounce back and get some wins. This team is talented, but they need to develop a post presence. Even when Julian Reese is not playing, he's not in the game, someone else has to step up and get it done in the paint.
You also need to shoot the ball. I know Michigan played some really good defense. You're not going to beat anybody. You're not going to beat the junior high team down the street if you 13% from the field and 11% from three-point in the first half. Way too far behind after 20 minutes as Maryland eventually falls 81-46. This is today's Big Stat brought to you by Gatorade. The Big Ten and ACC with the best records by conference. Of course, one bowl game still left to play. It involves the SEC and the Big 12. Those schools, 6-5 and 2-6, respectively. Of course, the Big 12 kind of hanging its hat right now on TCU. You win a national title, kind of erases a lot of the woes that have been there for that league in the postseason. Now, the Big Ten started off 4-0, 1-4 in the last 5 games, including a couple of tight losses in the college football playoff semifinal as we welcome Anthony Herron back in at 5-4 overall with 9 teams playing in the postseason, the teams that won versus the teams that lost. How do you put a bow and assess what the Big Ten postseason was?
Well, I certainly think that, as I referenced earlier, having 2 teams who are now national championship or bust, that's huge because that's just rarefied air for, legitimately having multiple teams whose fan bases probably should be disappointed if they're not at least in the national championship game, perhaps even winning it all. And Ohio State and Michigan are both in that conversation. And you look at, we talked about Michigan not playing their best game, but still able to force their way back into it against TCU and having a shot to win. In Ohio State, with all those other factors, controlling most of that game against the number 1 team in the country. So very impressed by that. But even spinning it forward towards next season where the Big Ten West is going to be just as wide open as it's ever been. You look at the Iowa Hawkeyes. They've got some offensive talent on the way in there at quarterback and tight end so far. But a defense that looked, again, like the Iowa defense. Deep up front, a secondary with guys returning that are taking the football away, scoring touchdowns. A lot to be excited about for Hawkeye fans. And even Minnesota, quietly in the midst of the longest postseason winning streak of any team in the country actively. So there's a lot in the Big Ten West. And that's not even mentioning some of the programs who bring in new coaching staffs. And we'll see how that part plays.
And let's not forget that if you take out the COVID year of what we consider the last 3 full seasons in college football, I believe there are only 10 teams that won at least 9 games in each of those 3 seasons. Yes, you have the teams that you expect, the Ohio States, the Alabama. You know who fits in there? Minnesota and PJ Fleck, the Gophers in each of the last 3 full regular seasons, winning at least 9 games, counting their bowl performances. You also didn't mention Maryland, but I think that's a big win for Mike Locksley and this team. Yeah. They talked heading into this year, listen, our goal is no longer just to get to a bowl, just to become bowl eligible. They build on last year, even without a great performance from Lia Tagovailoa in this game, and they're able to get it done. They're able to get it done defensively against NC State.
And that was the huge end of it because, assuming Lia Tagovailoa returns for another season, there's no reason to think that Lia Tagovailoa, what will continue to be a deep receiver and tight end core, multiple talented freshman running backs. So we should anticipate that Maryland's offense will be even more consistent than they were this past year, where Tagovailoa had set such a high standard and he knows Mike Locksley's offense. So I think the expectations ratcheted up on them, rightfully so. He will likely be closer to meeting those expectations just on offense. But what Brian Williams was able to do in taking over that Terps defense, it was on display again in their bowl matchup, just shutting down the opponent, getting even better in the second half. And that's one of those clues to how successful, how effective a coach is. When you come out in the second half and begin to play your best football, Maryland game after game did that over and over again. And for them to grow, like I mentioned, Michigan now working their way back into that national championship or bust conversation, it's a new standard that program has set. New standard for Maryland, where now we view Maryland as a team that should at least make a bowl game, and then we'll see how far they can push beyond that.
How did you feel about Locks with a giant hat getting the Mayo bath? You okay with that?
Well played. Great move by him. I mean, he said going in, we're getting a great look at it right here in slow-mo. But yes, the giant hat, a Maryland graduate who was a part of that, so you got not only Under Armour, but all the other fashion senses that Maryland alums are able to impart upon that program. But at least you can take the giant hat off. You can say I participated without having mayo.
And I don't have mayonnaise all over my body. Yeah. I also think Wisconsin deserves a ton of credit for this bowl victory. So much going on right now in Madison. Luke Fickell was on hand. Jim Leonhard was the coach, but Jim Leonhard won't be part of Luke Fickell's staff. Who knows who returns in Madison? We've already heard about transfer quarterbacks coming in to potentially be the next guy. Yeah. To be able to go into the offseason, to get those extra practices, and to be able to go in with momentum for a new coach, I don't think you can overstate how important that is.
And, schematically, it seems that Wisconsin will likely look very different with Phil Longo on the offensive side of things. So for them to be able to find a way to get that bowl win, and a lot of that was not only the ground attack, but also stifling defense, yet again, as has become the case to expect. And so credit to Jim Leonhard for being able to keep that together, and whatever awkwardness, just having a new coach coming in for the job Jim Leonhard wanted that he didn't get, and then Luke Fickell finds a way to work through that as well, effectively enough, with a few players who you may have hoped would have been there who weren't there, namely chief amongst those your starting quarterback, but finding a way to still perform at a high level against a football program in Oklahoma State that struggled down the stretch, but really wanted to be able to cap their season off on a high note. They weren't able to do it because Wisconsin played so well.
Now, I know it's typically not your day on Big Ten Today when helmet stickers are handed out, but I think you're aware of the concept.
I am, yes, I've heard of it.
So let's go to Anthony Herron's Big Ten helmet stickers as it relates to bowl performances for Big Ten players.
Well, let's start in Madison with that big bruising running back that we were just addressing a moment ago, and Braylon Allen, because he was a key cog for Wisconsin's offense, where their defense was able to frustrate Oklahoma State's offense and take the football away. But Braylon Allen, yet another game with a volume of carries and finding his way over 100 yards, controlling the clock for the Badgers. Huge effort for him, and he was really the mainstay for Wisconsin that showed up and performed well in the bowl. C.J. Stroud, obviously a huge part of that conversation also. So got to give a helmet sticker to the Buckeye QB in what may be his last game in an Ohio State uniform. Loved what I saw from him. Not only just the passing arsenal that we've come to know him for, the full field reads, but the mobility, the athleticism, the decisiveness, all those things with talent and playmakers just sort of dropping like flies around him. He would not allow that Ohio State offense to be denied. So I thought it was gratifying to see him have what, in my opinion, was the best game he's played as a Buckeye QB on that stage. And then finishing up with my alma mater. Now, you could have gone a couple of different ways with Iowa's defense.
Could have gone like 9 different ways.
Right, but I'm going to go with a guy who I hope is a part of Iowa's offense next season, but he is definitely a defensive playmaker in Cooper DeJean, because he played everywhere in high school, played everywhere effectively, and so far, everywhere he's been in his Iowa football career, he's made plays there as well, whether it's been covering kicks, on punt and kickoff coverage, whether it's been as a return man in the special teams phase, maybe it's inside as a safety, maybe it's outside as a corner or a nickel slot defender. But when he gets the football in his hands, he goes the other way, and it usually ends up being a house call. By the end of it, Cooper DeJean had more touchdown catches than any receiver on the Iowa offense.
It's an amazing stat.
It really is. And so for him to be that kind of playmaker and just mainly be featured on defense and special teams, if you don't really end up enhancing and revamping the playmakers on offense enough, then I will continue to pound this drum for Cooper DeJean to showcase the skills we saw on display in that bowl game. Start showcasing them on offense, too.
All right, quickly, before we let you go, we have to look ahead to 2023. Right. So which Big Ten team and for what reason are you most excited to watch the development of this Big Ten team next year?
You can just consider me in line with everyone else who's really intrigued by Penn State for next year. I mean, all the freshman talent that they have, not only in the backfield with Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen, but of course, what they have at quarterback in Drew Aller. And I've been covering Drew Aller since he was in high school. As a true freshman, he looked far more comfortable, far more effective behind center than even I anticipated because he's a big, strong, mobile, athletic guy, but his skills are a little bit raw. He looks like the future at quarterback, and the future is extremely bright.
I agree with that assessment, especially if a couple of those receivers can come back. Now, they'll lose some stuff on the outside. Parker Washington expected to be moving on. Mitchell Tinsley using up his eligibility. But that's what the portal is for these days. If you have a core, if you have running backs, if you have a quarterback, if you have a rock-solid defense, they will have that. You don't have to rely on those freshmen to come in and fill those holes. You can go to the portal, plug and play, because I'll tell you right now, there's a lot of really good players out there looking for a home who watched what Penn State did at the Rose Bowl and think to themselves, I can play for Manny Diaz, I can play for James Franklin. Yes, in fact, sign me up. All right, good stuff as always. Big Anthony Herron in for today's edition of Big Ten Today. But first, welcome you back inside our Big Ten Today studios, Rick Pizzo and Rayfel Davis. Let's discuss that Nebraska-Michigan State game. Maybe you can figure out Michigan State, because I can't figure out Michigan State. There are times when I think this team could absolutely contend for the Big Ten title. There are times when I think they'll struggle to get into the NCAA tournament. Which is the best version of Michigan State?
I think we've seen it against Buffalo, especially having Malik Hall back in the lineup. He was able to go out there just in 12 minutes, get 11 points, and you could see the other guys around him kind of have a calming sense that their guy was back on the court with them. So I think he means a great deal to this team. But what I liked about the other game the other night was that Joey Hauser stayed aggressive. Even with Malik Hall on the court, Joey Hauser was still able to go out there, end up with 14, 12, and 6 assists. And they're going to need both of those guys to keep it going. And then with Michigan State, can you take care of the basketball? The last couple of years, they've been throwing the ball over the gym at times, according to Tom Izzo. They were to get 21 assists in that last game, just 10 turnovers. A.J. Hogarth gets you 10 assists. He only has 2 turnovers. Offensively, this team was clicking, and now Jay Nakins is back. He's making shots. This team can compete to win the Big Ten.
That being said, I think in tonight's matchup, it's probably more defensively because when Nebraska gets it going, we saw it against Creighton, we've seen it against Iowa, they can beat really talented, really good teams when they run good offense. Can Michigan State kind of get in the mix? Because you can get the Huskers a little bit confused.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think Michigan State, you got to run your stuff. And then defensively, you got to get in Nebraska and make them uncomfortable. You got to have that Michigan State DNA, that gritty, grimy, push you around, maybe foul you a little extra. The ref can't call all of them. But you got to turn them over. They were able to turn Buffalo over 14 times. And when you turn teams over, it allows you to get out and run. And Michigan State, in their bloodline, they're a team that likes to get out on the break. And it's going to be a way for them to get out and run, because if this is a 50, 60-point game with Nebraska, Nebraska has a chance to win it.
Huskers are quietly having a nice little run with a couple of quality wins this year for Fred Hoiberg.
Yeah, I think Fred Hoiberg did a great job in the transfer portal. Bringing in Bandamule, Griesel, a hometown kid, and then Gary. It just was a great job to bring in good locker room pieces. And I don't think that goes noticed enough when you have a team and maybe it's ultra talented. You think of Virgin, McGowan's, super skillful players, but maybe they weren't the greatest locker room players for that team. And this year they have guys that want to play hard for their coach. They want to run a system. They want to lock up on defense, and it's just in their culture now.
Everybody at this level can score. And yes, there are some singular guys, but when you get a team buying into chemistry and defense, that's when a team can really do something special. Nebraska, Michigan State tonight, Big Ten Network, 7 Eastern, 6 Central time. The nightcap takes us to Madison. It's Wisconsin and Minnesota. Once again, of course, the world picked Wisconsin, the bottom half of the Big Ten. And, of course, as the calendar turns to 2023, they're ranked inside the top 15. What makes this particular Wisconsin team dangerous?
Now they can beat you in a lot of different ways. Even in their last game, Steven Crowd gets you 25 and 8. He knocks down 3 3-pointers. As a team, they make 12 of them. They're not going to beat themselves. Wisconsin is not a team. They're not going to take bad shots. They're not going to turn the ball over. Just 4 turnovers against Western Michigan in their last game to 16 assists. So offensively, they're solid. They have 2 guys that can lead the way and lead the locker room, and Tyler Wall and Chucky Hepburn. And now with Crowd, he's getting going, gives them a 3-headed monster. And then their role players have been really solid. Connor Essegian, one of the better freshmen in the Big Ten. Klesmit has been big, making shots. And then now you got Jordan Davis knocking in some threes. This team is rolling, and defensively, they're on a string. They're not going to gamble too much. They're not going to jump in the passing lane. They're just not going to beat themselves on either end.
That's one of those teams where you know fundamentally what they're going to do every year, regardless of roster. And this is the same year. I still don't get it. I know I beat this dead horse every year, but everybody picks them to be outside the Big Ten, and it never happened. Just stop doing it. Stop doing it, and you will look a lot smarter at the end of the year when the Badgers are inside the top 4, because that's where they are every year. Now, their opponent tonight, Minnesota, really struggling. I mean, this team has been through injury, illness, inconsistency. Right now, they just don't really have the roster to compete on a lot of given nights. They're playing hard for Ben Johnson, who is trying to push all the right buttons. If you're Coach Johnson, how do you start to approach 2023, knowing the reality is the postseason's not going to be there in March?
You got to keep building up your guys. And I've been on a team that I knew we weren't going to play in the postseason. I finished last place in the Big Ten. And it's not a thing where you go out there and you think you're going to lose. You still know that you have a chance. You're a high major basketball player. You just got to go out there and play your tail off. And someone's going to get beat. If you go back to that Frank Kaminsky, that Wisconsin team, they lose to Rutgers, and Rutgers was really struggling that year, bottom of the Big Ten. So there's teams can be beat at any time, but these guys, you got to just depend on Dawson Garcia, Jamison Battle, hope they can combine for 40 to 50 points a night. Taylon Cooper is one of the best assist guys in the country, but he's got to score the ball a little bit more to even give him a chance.
And you know that there are still a couple of nights, probably 2 or 3 for the rest of this season, where Jamison Battle has a chance to go for 30 or 35, because that's what kind of scorer he is. And on that night, can he get just enough help from Dawson Garcia and the rest of those guys to maybe pull off a big-time upset? Minnesota and Wisconsin, 9 Eastern, 8 local time here on the Big Ten Network.